Okay, so we should be recording it in play mode if everything is cooperating. This is just for you viewers at home, Unit 1, Part 1 on Foundations of Government. And one of the things that I want you to do is to write out a formal definition of government for continuing on. So pause and write out your formal definition of government so you can see if you know what you signed up for and so you can see how it compares to what we're going to go over. Again, guys, we're going to try to go, somewhat fast-paced, but I do want us to have a focus. So our focus, our objective with this first unit is to, one, begin to try to have you guys see an overall pattern to everything that you've studied so far. So you've studied world history, you've studied U.S. history, and there are these kind of key fundamental kind of moments or events that, in my view and in my mind, are part of a kind of a linear path to where we are today. You can kind of look at absolutism and then the Enlightenment and the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, and on these events kind of go. And each of them brings us a little closer to the form of government we are today, as if they are part of a deliberate evolutionary process. So one of the things I'm going to be doing in this unit, and maybe more specifically in the next unit, is surfacing those events and trying to show you the kind of key governmental cornerstones they led to, the foundational principles upon which our government is based that came from those events. All right? So I do want you to see, as we look at mostly world history today and some key moments, and then in the future U.S. history unit, those events and their connection to where we are today, as if they are part of this evolutionary process that has made us much more evolved, right? The other and perhaps more important thing that we're going to do here today is just get your foundation down. A lot of what we're doing today is about terminology. So when you are doing any of these AP courses, there's a language that you have to have. And you have to be fluent in that language because it's not just about identifying and defining. There's an application phase. And a lot of times what AP teachers do that's a mistake is they go right to the critical kind of analytical level. And we neglect that everybody needs time to work on the language and develop the vocabulary and get a fluency there. So we're going to look at concepts that you should hopefully know prior to any kind of formal study of government on the micro level that we're about to do. And we're going to make sure that you are kind of fluent in it, you have the ability to analyze. Because in some ways I've stressed that this course is like an engineering course, that we want to know how the car works in this case, and that's by studying its component parts and understanding these component parts independently. It's by understanding how they're supposed to work in theory, but then it's understanding how they actually work when they're back in the car and working in reality, okay? So those are our two major objectives, just to kind of surface some events that you've studied before and show you that there is this kind of evolutionary process that has led us to where we are today, and in the process also develop some language, okay? So now we're going to start, if we're studying government, we're going to start with a formal definition. And I always think it's beneficial to kind of compare what you think to how a textbook might define government. And what I think you're going to find is that this is kind of a sterile, dull definition, and yours might be a little more meaningful, but I bet you there's some parallels. To start with, just in terms of a dry kind of definition, it identifies that government is made up of institutions and people. All right. So hopefully, in your definition, you thought about that there are certain structures within government, and that those structures are run by individuals, right? And I guarantee every single one of you had some idea of power or authority, that these institutions or people have authority. The question is, what do they have that power to do? And that's to make laws and carry out public policies. Now, the reason I've kind of highlighted each of these concepts is each, it's going to remain sterile. It's going to remain this kind of dull textbook definition. until we look a little closer at what we mean by institutions, people, laws, and public policy. And in that way, your definition has a little more meaning, okay? The first thing that I hope you see is that, I don't know, any student that's doing civics hopefully comes to a class and they understand there's how many branches of government? 3. Very good. All right, we're all A pluses so far, and you're on tape as answering, right? There's 3 branches of government, right? And within those branches, hopefully you can identify certain individuals. For example, who heads the executive branch? The president. Okay. Most of us at that point then start to run out, right? So if I said, okay, who within the legislative branch represents you? What do we have? We have 2 houses. What are the 2 houses? Senate and the House of Representatives. If I said, who is your 2 senators?
And Markey.
Very good. Markey. So I was in Newburyport, and there was an old-fashioned car show. And Ed Markey, our senator, and he's a junior senator, he's recent, was walking down the street. And there were, he was with the mayor of Newburyport. And nobody recognized either of the 2. They just kind of, he had a suit even and an entourage, and people didn't recognize him. Anybody know your congressman? Seth Moulton. Very good. Can you name any other individual in government beyond that?
Name or position?
By name and position.
All right.
Very good. Very good. So we know some key individuals within the House and the Senate, right? What I want to point out is that your list is maybe more sophisticated than most people. It may go a little longer, but it probably still falls short of identifying every single individual and institution within government. And the purpose of this course is to get you, on some level, a little more politically fluent, to know, by some estimates, and notice it says estimates, there are over 2,000 governmental departments, agencies, branches, divisions. It's sprawling. And why I say by some estimates, even the government doesn't quite know how many organizations and institutions it has. It doesn't, there's a lot of overlap and in some cases redundancy. And one of the things they don't necessarily have is a formal department or agency that kind of has some oversight over all of that. Hence, they don't quite know the numbers. Now, another thing I could mention too, and this is just, again, we're working on vocabulary. In addition to the formal departments and agencies and governmental corporations, there are what are called linkage institutions. And this is a term that will come up throughout the year. And it's one that always, I think, gives kids a little bit of a pause because it is exactly what it sounds like, but it's just something foreign about the idea. What a linkage institution is anything that is outside of government but connects you to government. So the classic examples are political parties. Those aren't, part of the 3 branches or part of the formal departments or agencies, and yet they uniquely connect people to government. The media is another good example of a linkage institution. You have interest groups, and you'll become, fairly familiar with them. There are all kinds of groups working on a particular cause or issue, and they definitely make government transparent and give you ways to kind of impact and connect to government, okay? So that's part of the fabric as well. So not only are there over 2,000 departments and agencies, there are all these linkage institutions, and my list of 2,000 departments and agencies often employs hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of employees. So it's not just the president, it's not just Elizabeth Warren, it's not just Ed Markey. For example, if we were going to the Department of Defense, yes, there is a Secretary of Defense, the head of that department and a cabinet official, but there's also over 750,000 people working within the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense has oversight over the over 1 million active duty and 1 million reserve forces that are out there. So kind of a fun thing to do, and I'm going to give you guys a link. I say this is fun, and I did it with a straight face. Did you see that? Is, again, the government doesn't necessarily have a great way of tracking it. You sometimes have to go to external sources like colleges and universities. And this is just a list of government agencies by department alphabetically. And each of them, if you were to click on it, would open up the website to this particular department or agency or site, right? What I want you to do at some point is I want you to go through and not only get a sense of how sprawling it is, I want you to get a sense of like how important it is. Like, what would you do away with? Right? You know, we've got this thing here on the Appalachian Region commissions. Okay, well, what the heck do they do, and what's the value there? But if you were to open it up, you'd find that the Appalachians are one of the most economically depressed areas. It is obviously a kind of a key environmental area, though, and both of those issues require some attention. They require some help in both cases, right? So what's kind of fun, again, is you're going to scroll through and you're going to stop it. Look where the cursor, is and where we are alphabetically. That's your list of over 2,000 departments and agencies. And again, I want you at some point to kind of go through this list and just say, okay, which one doesn't make sense? Which one would I do away with? And almost every single one of them is going to be a hard decision. Getting to the U's. All right? So again, one of the things that we'll do is we're going to sophisticate your understanding of people and institutions. And we're going to get beyond the president and your congressman. And we're going to get you to start knowing some of those 2,000 departments, agencies, and we're going to get you to know some of the people that head those things. And we're going to begin to understand the authority that those individuals have to make laws and carry out public policies. So again, to keep breaking down those terms, authority is a really important concept. I mean, it is obvious what it is. It means to have the power to compel and to govern. But as obvious as it is to some people, it is fairly subjective. How do I know if authority actually exists? It's a subjective concept. Authority is really only there if people acknowledge it, if they recognize it, if it's both kind of internally and externally validated. So it's a very kind of, it's kind of like Quicksilver to put your hands on. But it is important that we put our hands on it because this is a device that we can use to begin to classify and define government. And you're going to see that in some upcoming slides in a moment. The nature and location of authority is how we tell what we're looking at. So for example, if authority rests with a single individual that receives that power through blood, through heredity, what am I looking at? I'm looking at a monarchy, right? If authority is with the people, what am I looking at? Democracy. So I can talk about where power is, and in a second, in terms of who, and I can also talk about where power is in terms of geography, and we'll use that to classify government. So again, it's kind of a subjective concept that it only exists if we agree it exists. Kind of like the tooth fairy, right? On the other hand, it is important to kind of define, quantify, and locate because that's how we'll classify things. Now, laws. Again, if I were to ask you to define it, I think you'd know what it is. But it is important, again, we're in an AP course where it's important to use precise terminology because laws are a specific kind of concept with specific language to it that distinguishes it from, say, norms or values, right? So we have certain values, we have certain norms, we have certain customs and expectations. What separates law from all of that is that if you violate a value or a custom, are there consequences besides having to do the shame march, right? Is there any kind of larger consequences? Not necessarily. There's social kind of ostracization, but there's no larger consequence. With law, it's enforced by a higher authority. And, as we get into it, there'll be gradations of penalties. There's offenses that might have a fine, some sort of sanction, and then you work your way up through misdemeanors and felonies, and those include a loss of civil liberties and, jail time, right? Again, laws are just, again, a body of rules. I threw in a new concept for you guys, and I bet you probably didn't have this in your original definition, and it's called public policy. And again, this is kind of one of those obvious yet confusing terms. I went to George Washington in Washington, D.C. I was a political science major. And a lot of people studied and worked in policy. And I remember being kind of baffled by this. You know, it was a term that they used to mean everything and nothing. And I'm like, what the heck is policy? And that's the unfortunate thing about this term, is it is kind of everything and nothing. Laws have to have an intent. And ideally, there's a cumulative intent behind all our laws and behind all the governmental actions. So ideally, when it comes to an issue, the government is hopefully working in a particular direction. And its laws and its actions are meant to influence change and improve things with regards to that issue. So what I want you to think about is, when you think about public policy, anybody who studies it or works in it is looking at every single button and lever that they can push and pull to influence an issue, right? There's a cumulative intent behind our laws. There are a number of things that we can do, and policy represents the sum total of everything we've done to try to influence an issue or topic. Again, laws and actions have a fabric. On some level, you may not see the threads, but on some level, hopefully they're connected. Here's a good example. All right, so there's been a rash of mass shootings, and I should have the graphic, but I'll pull it up for you at some point. 177 mass shootings, and they define mass shootings by an event where there's more than 3 people shot. And there's concern about obviously security and safety. What's our policy towards that? You know, how are we going to approach what seems to be a rising tide of violence? One thing that we have to do in terms of our policy is really understand the numbers, and understand, are the numbers as bad as we think they are, and what are some of the forces driving them? So when we think about policy, part of the approach is research and information. That's a step towards fixing an issue. One of the things that we find is, out of the 177 mass shootings, that there are 4 with specific links to radical, fundamentalists. So when we begin to say, how do we address this problem, we have to say, okay, is there a problem with radical fundamentalists? Is that one of the buttons and levers that I have to push? It is immigration, one of the things that I have to look at when I'm thinking about public policy in terms of public safety and safety in terms of mass shootings. Certainly guns are an influence in the mass shootings. And, the larger the assault rifle with the larger magazines and the more automatic capacities probably is of a concern. So we have to look at gun control issues. We got to look at immigration. We got to look at gun control. We have to look certainly at mental health, because somebody who is probably in a normal state of mind would not do these kind of things. So mental health definitely plays an issue. So this is not a simple, there's one law that fixes this. We have to study. We have to kind of think about the issue on multiple fronts, and we have to kind of approach it through both laws, and there's executive actions that can happen. Maybe we do some public awareness. We did that a lot with, like, if you see something suspicious, report it. There's a lot of things that we can do to approach this. Another good example would be a public health issue. The United States is unique in that we have a high enough standard of living that we don't face malnourishment as much as we do obesity. And so if you want to look at, for example, adolescent obesity, that is a primary kind of concern. Because there's long-term health issues, obviously, that go along with that. So what are all the buttons and levers that we push and pull there? Well, again, there's research. There's public kind of awareness campaigns that we can do. There are, ways that we can encourage kind of healthy eating. Some of it is just by maybe partnering with schools and improving school lunches. Some of it might be by looking out at communities that face, like it's called a food oasis, that the only kind of access to they don't have a Whole Foods. They don't have even, let's say, a Demoulas or a Shaw's or something like that. What they have is access to McDonald's and things like that. So do we need to kind of address that? We can look at it with our tax policy and say, you know what, I want to discourage people from drinking soda. That's something that is loaded with sugar, has like no nutritional value, is kind of addictive in terms of its sugar rush. Let me tax the heck out of soda so that people don't drink it. All of those steps together, again, represent public policy. And again, some of it gets kind of confusing because you can't see the pattern sometimes. Everything seems kind of independent. The other thing that obscures it is how we arrive at public policy, which is through politics. So here's another term that we can define. Politics. It used to be, I think, it was admirable to go into politics. Someone who was a politician might be admired. It was a noble profession. And then eventually it became kind of a dirty word. And that's, I guess, in part what we're trying to sort out here. If you call somebody political, do you mean that nicely? Or do you mean that they're kind of this, manipulative individual who would lie to your face and have their fingers crossed behind their back? Do you mean that somebody who's political is just kind of self-serving and going after their own things? This, by the way, is actually a shot from Turkish Parliament. Every once in a while, it seems like our government, might be uncivilized. We're certainly polarized, but rarely do we break out into fistfights, and I'll have clips for you later on. It is watching British Parliament. I don't know why you're not home watching that right now. It is among the most entertaining of kind of political theater out there. They shout and yell at each other. Even the prime minister often shows up, and they'll yell at him. But it doesn't break out into fistfights, and there are all kinds of places that I can show you do. All right? Is this your version of politics? Because that's kind of what it's devolved down into. Or is it, this is from Raphael's School of Athens, and it features all these great minds within the same room, kind of, enlightening each other and having a conversation. Is that politics? Or is it somewhere in between, right? Really what politics is it's the struggle between competing ideas, and we lose this concept, the idea of compromise. Some of what politics has become perhaps is a hostage situation, a situation where no one gets out alive. It's all I care about is thwarting the other side, and we lose the idea of compromise. But that is, and that's, I think, one of the importance of a government course, is to remind people that politics only works when we are willing to compromise, where we are willing to kind of come to the center or the middle, right? Another way of defining it, who gets what, when, and how. And because there are so many different interests competing for influence, that's often what muddles policy. That's why it doesn't look like a bright line. Because oftentimes, we've got a crisis in terms of health. We've got a crisis in terms of mass shootings. But what happens is the different sides pull us in different directions, and there isn't this straight kind of march to an event. It's messy. It goes back and forth, but eventually we might arrive at an outcome, and a good student of government knows how to kind of find that outcome. Okay, so that's government. The thing that we need to talk about next is the actual physical framework that government works in, and that's called the state. Government needs a kind of a physical location to work with it. And again, since we brought the term up, we need to define it. And again, because the definition is generic, we need to pull out some of those key ideas and look at them a little more closely. So a state is got a number of ingredients, and first and foremost is the idea of people. You need kind of a population to be qualified as a state, and they need to be living within a defined territory. The territory we'll look at in a second doesn't necessarily have to be contiguous, but there does need to be, in other words, it doesn't have to necessarily be connected. But you do need a physical place that these people operate out of under a government. There should be some sort of central authority directing things. And that authority needs to be, we'll bring this term up in a second, sovereign. Sovereign means the right to rule independently. If you are sovereign, there is not a power above you that can override you. So you guys are teenagers, soon you're going to go off to college, soon you will become sovereign. soon you'll be able to kind of make decisions independently without that higher authority. Although you'll find that you continually check in with your parents, probably even when you're 60, right? The idea of sovereign is that idea of no higher authority to override or cancel you. So if these are the simple kind of ingredients to make up a state, you're going to see that there's a tremendous amount of diversity within a state. There's over, according to our Department of State, over 194 states, and each one does not look like the other. So again, we need to dig down a little bit more to understand each of these terms and to understand why there is such a diversity. So for example, when we talk about people, there's not a numeric requirement to be a state. You can be as small as the Vatican, which has actually less than 1,000 people. It has 800 living within a very small territory within Rome. Vatican is the home to the Pope, and the State Department and many nations consider it the center of the Catholic Church and therefore a state, right? So, you can look at the Vatican, and you can go all the way up to, what's the largest country in terms of population? Anybody know? China. Does anybody know what number 2 is? India. And then we are number 3. So what's the population of China, roughly? Anybody know?
1.5.
Yeah, 1.5
billion.
billion, right? And we are, where are we at? 350 million, right? So we're the decimal. That's a big place, isn't it? That outnumbers us by 1 billion. We're the decimal. And we're number 3. And then you go all the way down to 800. So the numbers really don't matter, do they? It also doesn't matter in terms of the ethnic, religious, cultural identity. You don't need to have a homogeneous population, meaning you don't all have to be the same. Myanmar has over 135 ethnicities. They're an incredibly culturally diverse place. They still are all one people under one country. What unifies them, what the central feature you have to have in order to be a person within a state is citizenship. So each of those, 195 states that we looked at, each of them is kind of distinguished by the fact that they grant their people citizenship. Citizenship is something we'll dive into more so at the end of the lecture series, but what defines it is it's a legal status that does 2 things. It gives you, and this is what most of us focus on, the idea of rights. The government will use its authority to guarantee certain freedoms and liberties. And that's where usually most of us stop. What you need to remember is that there are also responsibilities, that you can't get something for nothing. In order for the government to guarantee and protect your rights and liberties, you need to do certain fundamental things to support the government. So there will be, we're going to distinguish it more. Right now I'm just talking about responsibilities, but some of those responsibilities are by law, and some of them are just more kind of, obligations, but call them duties. So, for example, in the United States, by law, we all have to pay taxes. If you want things, you have to pay for them. So we all have to pay taxes. In terms of military service, what do you have to do? You basically have to register for a potential draft. It's at age 18, males have to sign up for what is called the selective service. And that's by law, right? What does Israel make you do? In Switzerland, serve. Everybody, men and women, have compulsory service. So those are a couple of the mandatory things. What else might you get in the mail once you get to age 18? Jury duty, all right? Those are by law. But in terms of what's interesting is political participation. That's both a right. You have a right to vote, don't you, in this country? But you also have an obligation to vote. So that kind of straddles both. Loyalty we'll talk about a little bit. And again, we'll get into it a little bit later on. But there's this idea of what are the other ways that you can support your country and be patriotic? And when does patriotism, begin to strangle individual liberty and begin to go into scary things like hyper-nationalism? These are just examples of more home front efforts to get you to conserve and get you to think about the nation and the nation at war and what the troops need. Okay, so we're going to get into that a little bit more, but the thing that I want to stress here is the idea that what makes a people is this legal status given to them by their government called citizenship, and it's two sides of a coin. It's both what you're given, but what is also expected. All right. In terms of territory, same idea. In that, if we talked about population, no kind of numeric requirements for it. Same thing with territory. Territory is simply defined by a definitive, recognizable, honored kind of boundary that separates one state from another. And again, I mentioned it doesn't have to be contiguous necessarily. Palestine is a great example. When there was the Palestine Liberation Organization, and they were looking to kind of carve out a home in Palestine, anybody who was Palestinian was considered part of that state, regardless of where you lived. So doesn't have to be contiguous, doesn't necessarily have to have a restriction on size. We come back to the Vatican again. That's 1 square mile. It's a series of city blocks in Rome. You compare it to Russia, which is the largest state out there in terms of geography, which is over 17 million square miles. So it's kind of fun. You can kind of see, there's Italy, and there's Rome, and there's the Vatican, and there's Russia, and both are considered states. By the way, too, not only does Russia qualify, it has territory, and it's defined by these boundaries, but it includes airspace. If you fly into someone's airspace, you're violating their territory. It includes their water rights. It includes the natural resources within the country. So there's a number of things that we have to think about when we call territory. It's not just this little picture on the map. It's everything above and below and around, right? Authority, we come back to this again, and I've done some of this already. It's kind of an ephemeral, subjective concept. And authority typically only exists if others recognize it, right? Sometimes I use the word sovereignty interchangeable with authority. So you just want to kind of know each authority is obviously kind of power. More uniquely, when we talk about sovereignty, it's an ability to use that power without the consent of somebody else, without a higher authority. There's no one you need to check in with, right? I mentioned that the location will help us locate the type of government we're looking at. That's where we're going to go next. And I mentioned that, again, it is subjective. Taiwan and Hong Kong are really interesting examples because in both cases, these are areas that have a degree of independence, but who takes objection? China. China has a one China policy. In China, there's a colonial history to both of these places, and there is a degree of autonomy that the rest of the world looks to foster, I suppose. But if you want to have relations with China, and there are 1.3 billion people, and have trade with them, and have influence over them, you have to kind of walk a fine line because they don't recognize the independence of Taiwan and Hong Kong. So again, are these places really sovereign? Not necessarily, because there's a kind of a global debate about it. What would make them sovereign? Well, really what makes a place sovereign is their ability, again, to act independently. We see that kind of physically when they can conduct foreign policies. There's something called the G8 summit. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, where it's actually the G30, but within it is more powerful kind of nations that make up the core. What it is countries that are economic powerhouses that get together that try to formulate global economic policy. And the United States is a member of the G8, the 8 most influential, and we get invited to those summits. If you don't get invited to the G8, if you're not part of the UN, if you're not part of the World Bank and other kind of international forums, you might not have sovereignty. If you can't control your borders, if they are porous, if people kind of routinely, violate them, you may not have sovereignty. And certainly if you don't have a diplomatic corps that is welcomed in other countries, you may not be sovereign. So again, it's an important concept, but it's subjective, and sometimes we need these external indicators to understand that it's there. On a final note too, what makes it particularly important too is we use sovereignty, we use this idea of authority to distinguish the 194 kind of states that actually have authority from lesser political units. in the United States, we're made up of 50 states. Do we fit this definition? Do we have people that have citizenship? Are you a citizen of Massachusetts? All right, we'll check that box. Do you have territory? We have an odd kind of, there's the Cape, right? So there's territory. Do you have authority? Can you act independent? Can Massachusetts act independently without a hierarchy? Can we decide we're going to war with Canada? No. Can we kind of print our own money? Massachusetts bucks. No. There is a higher authority. There is a central government. So in some ways, we use states as a bit of a misnomer. Back when we were 13 colonies that became 13 states, we were actually 13 states because we were basically did act independently. We thought of ourselves as citizens of Massachusetts. It's just because of that historic identity that we keep the name. We've evolved into lesser political units that are under a central government. And by the way, Massachusetts isn't a state. It is one of 3 what? Commonwealths, right? For the benefit of all from our puritanical past. We'll get to that later. Okay? So just a quick side note. There is kind of, in the news evidence that China makes the identity of Taiwan and Hong Kong kind of troublesome. And what we're going to do is move into kind of our next phase, which is defining and classifying types of governments, all right? So I'm going to do a kind of a quick pause because we're at kind of part 2 with my face looming in the camera.